I married Richard, who was my high school classmate. However, once we started living together, I realized that Richard was someone who imposed his own preferences on me. Whenever I complained about it to my best friend, Amy, she would always sympathize with me, which was my only solace. But one day, I saw Richard and Amy walking arm in arm into a hotel. 2 weeks later, Amy invited me to visit her and her husband, Tom. As Tom led the toast, I was about to pour the wine I had brought as my gift when Richard suddenly shouted,
"She's pregnant, so give her tea."
Pregnant? Since when?
Richard quickly put his hand over his mouth with a look of regret.
I didn't hear anything about this. How does Richard know?
Silence.
From his reaction, it was clear that the father of Amy's baby wasn't Tom, but Richard. The thought of what would happen next made me want to laugh. I couldn't wait to hear the excuses they would come up with. I was looking forward to it. They were going to have to clean up the mess they made. My name is Sarah, a 42-year-old housewife. I've been married to Richard, my high school classmate, for 3 years. Back in high school, I only saw Richard as just another classmate. But a few years ago, we met again at a reunion, and seeing how handsome he had become, my heart skipped a beat. Richard seemed interested in me too, as he sat next to me at the after party and actively struck up our conversation. As we were leaving, he asked me, "Would you like to date with marriage in mind?" And I quickly agreed. I had been so focused on work that I had almost given up on getting married, so there was a sense of urgency in me that this was my last chance. After dating for 2 years, we got married. I was filled with excitement at the thought of the happy life we were about to start together. At that time, I had no idea what Richard's true nature was. Once we started living together, I realized Richard was someone with very strong preferences. He had countless rules for daily life. But what made it worse was that he forced these rules on others. For example, here's how it goes. In the morning, before waking him up, I have to open all the curtains in the house. The TV has to be set to his usual news channel. His eggs have to be sunny side up, and the bread should be slightly firm. It can't be too soft or too hard. There are also specific brands for spices, the strength of the coffee, and even how the laundry is folded and how the house is cleaned. If I break any of these rules, he gets upset.
This yolk is a bit too firm, isn't it? Can you even fry an egg properly?
Sorry, if you're that particular about it, why don't you cook it yourself? I hesitantly suggested, only to be met with a fierce rebuttal.
Cooking is a woman's job. A wife shouldn't talk back. Just do what your husband says and be quiet.
He orders me around with an outdated view of what makes a good wife, always acting superior. And then, without fail, he brings up his mom.
My mom did everything just the way I wanted. You should be able to do the same, right?
Honestly, it's hard being compared to his mom, who was a full-time housewife and lived for taking care of her only son.
Oh, and don't use work as an excuse. I let you keep working after we got married because you wanted to.
Richard would fold his arms, stick out his chin, and look down at me with a smirk.
We could live off my salary alone. But I'm indulging your selfishness. You should be more grateful.
Hearing this kind of talk all year round is really wearing me down. Since my parents live far enough that I need to fly home, visiting them for Thanksgiving and Christmas is all I can manage. When we visit my parents together, Richard plays the role of a good husband, so they believe we have a happy marriage. Sometimes I talk to my parents by phone or email, but I don't reveal his true nature because I don't want them to worry. So I can't vent about Richard to them. The only person I can talk to is my best friend, Amy. Amy was a classmate from high school and has known Richard for a long time, so it's easy to talk to her.
Richard is so charming when we're out, but he's like that at home. That's disappointing.
Amy would say, frowning as she fiddled with her iced coffee straw, her chin resting on her hand. Even when making that face, she was still so beautiful, her expression never faltering. I swallowed my sandwich and sighed. If I had known he was this particular, I wouldn't have married him. Amy, your husband is quiet, isn't he? You're lucky. After a brief pause, Amy forced a smile.
Tom may not be much of a talker, but when it counts, he's someone I can really rely on.
I couldn't help but feel envious of Amy as she proudly bragged about her husband. Richard, on the other hand, is all charm and competence outside the house, but at home, he's a tyrant. My dissatisfaction with him kept growing, but the idea of divorcing just a few years into the marriage felt like giving up too soon, so I hesitated. The thought of divorce wasn't just because of Richard, though. His mom, Emily, is quite a character too. She doted on Richard, her only child, since he was little, and after his dad passed away a few years ago, her overbearing nature seemed to intensify. The apartment where we live is a 2-hour drive from Richard's parents' house. The distance is a relief since it spares us from unannounced visits, but in exchange, Emily calls me almost every other day.
Sarah, what's for dinner tonight?
Buffalo wings and potato salad. When I answer honestly, she responds with her usual criticism.
That cheap chicken won't do. You should be using organic chicken and potato salad. Sarah, you still have no sense of taste, do you?
On another day, it's only organic beef will do, or you should be using lobster instead of shrimp, and so on. She's relentless.
Richard is a department manager at a major company, isn't he? You should be spending more on food.
We can't afford that kind of luxury. Richard controls the finances, and he often tells me to cut back on groceries and household expenses. And I continued. Emily, you're getting money from Richard, right? You know we don't have much left over, don't you? Before I could finish, Emily hung up on me. Even when I complained to Richard about how hard it was to deal with her, he just shrugged it off with a half smile.
My mom cares about me too much, so she tends to go overboard.
I understand, but...
Oh, I know. I'll take her shopping this Sunday.
Again? The complaint slipped out before I could stop it. She calls you almost every week. Lately, you've been working late, going on overnight business trips, and working weekends. You're hardly ever home. When I protested, Richard's expression darkened.
What do you want me to do? My mom has no one else to rely on, and my work is busy.
But it's our 3rd wedding anniversary. I was really looking forward to it. Usually, Richard is overbearing, but on this day, he was sweet enough to bring me flowers and take me to a restaurant with a nice view. As I hung my head, Richard exploded in anger.
Stop whining. It's just an anniversary. Of course, I'm going to prioritize my mom over you.
When I started to tear up, he clicked his tongue.
Don't cry. It's annoying. Cancel the restaurant reservation.
His cold words left me utterly disheartened. When I told Amy about it, she was furious.
Richard is taking you for granted, Sarah. You were so excited about it, too.
She sympathized with me as she poked at her salad, noticing how down I was. Yeah. Oh, did you order herbal tea instead of coffee? That's unusual for you. Amy's shoulders twitched slightly.
Oh, yeah. I just thought it would be nice for a change. Oh, I know.
Amy clapped her hands, forcefully changing the subjects.
Let's redo your anniversary.
What? She smiled and made a suggestion.
You know how Tom is good at cooking, right? And I love baking, so why don't we host you and Richard at our place? We'll throw a party for your 3rd anniversary.
I'd love that, but you're a stay-at-home mom, and Tom must be really busy with his work. I don't want to take away his precious time off. I tried to be considerate, but Amy cheerfully brushed it off.
It's totally fine. We'd be happy to help with something like this.
Her supportive words made my heart swell with gratitude. Thank you, Amy. You've always been there for me since high school.
Come on, don't be so formal.
Amy laughed shyly, and I was genuinely thankful from the bottom of my heart. That night, when I told Richard about the anniversary party after he got home from work, he surprisingly agreed without hesitation.
Well, I feel bad for ruining our anniversary, so I'll let my mom know about the new plan.
Please do. If you cancel last minute again, it'll really inconvenience Amy and Tom.
Yeah, I got it.
As I was texting Amy about the plan, I overheard Richard mumbling to himself.
Amy's desserts are really good. I'm looking forward to it.
His smug expression made me curious. Have you tried Amy's desserts before? I don't remember giving you any since you're not a fan of sweets. Richard's expression stiffened slightly. He quickly answered, looking flustered.
Well, I secretly tried some before.
Really? I didn't notice. Even though it felt odd, our conversation ended as Richard went to take a shower. Thinking about how to thank Amy and Tom, I decided to bring a wine that pairs well with Italian food. Since Tom works for a trading company, they live in a fancy high-rise apartment. I figured they'd prepare an elaborate meal, so I wanted to choose something that would match their hospitality. On my way home from work, I stopped by a specialty liquor store in the downtown area. I bought a highly recommended wine I had read about online and was walking home with a spring in my step when a familiar figure caught my eye. It was Richard in a jacket, and the woman holding his hand was unmistakably Amy. I stared at them in disbelief as they walked a few meters ahead of me. Richard was supposed to be on his business trip in another state today. But there's no way I could mistake my husband and my best friend of 25 years. The voices I heard were unmistakably theirs. The way they clung to each other, they looked just like a couple in love. Without noticing me walking a little behind them, Richard and Amy casually disappeared into a hotel. I was recording the whole scene on my phone, and I made sure to capture that moment as well. After they vanished from sight, I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. I stepped aside to the edge of the busy sidewalk, replayed the video on my phone, and realized this was my reality. A mix of anger, disappointment, and sadness overwhelmed me. Amy, of all people. She's the one I've always confided in, even about my love life, since we were students. Why would she do something like this? I wiped the tears from the corners of my eyes with the back of my hand. But as I thought back, several things started to make sense. Richard must have known how good Amy's desserts were because he'd been eating them regularly. And it made sense now why he so readily agreed to the party. When I got home, I lost my appetite and went to bed early. As I calmed down a bit, a wave of intense anger toward the two of them hit me. I'd had enough. It's time to divorce Richard. But before that, I need to get some revenge. 2 weeks later, on the day of our 3rd anniversary party, I could feel my blood boiling as I watched Richard act like everything was fine, but I made sure not to show it and prepared to go out. I have to stop somewhere on the way back, so let's drive separately.
Yeah, sure.
Instead of saying, I don't want to breathe the same air as you, I gave a polite excuse for driving separately to Amy and Tom's high-rise apartment.
Welcome.
Completely oblivious to what I knew, Amy greeted us with a big smile. Thanks for having us today.
Your place is as beautiful as always.
Tom, who always looks serious, smiled as he spoke.
Thank you. Please come in.
As I looked for the right moment to expose their affair, we sat down at the dining table. Amy served a tomato and mozzarella salad as an appetizer.
That wine looks delicious. Let's start with a toast.
As Tom proposed a toast, I was about to pour the wine I had brought when Richard suddenly shouted,
She can't drink wine because she's pregnant. So give her tea instead.
The room fell silent.
Pregnant? Since when?
Richard quickly covered his mouth with his hand, realizing his mistake.
I didn't hear anything about this. How does Richard know?
Silence.
Richard and Amy, sitting across from each other, fell silent at the very reasonable question. I couldn't believe she was actually pregnant. Judging by their reaction, it was clear that the father of Amy's baby wasn't Tom, but Richard. Rather than feeling angry, I couldn't help but start laughing as I imagined what would happen next. What kind of excuses are they going to come up with? I'm really looking forward to it. Amy, who pretended to be my best friend while betraying me so calmly. And Richard, who got involved with his wife's best friend. They're going to have to clean up the mess they've made. After sitting there with a sullen expression for a while, Amy suddenly raised her head. She flashed a sycophantic smile at Tom, who was sitting next to her.
Actually, I was planning to surprise Tom with the news. I wanted to catch him off guard.
Liar, I muttered, and Amy, pouting her bright red lips, snapped back.
Sorry I didn't say anything sooner, but why are you blaming me? You're my best friend, aren't you? You should be congratulating me.
She spoke in a sorrowful tone, and Richard quickly jumped in to back her up.
Yeah. Amy's 3 months along now. It's a critical time. Please, don't upset her.
Oh, really? You seem to know a lot. It's almost like Richard's the father. Richard and Amy both gasped and froze.
No way that's true.
Don't even joke about that.
I feel the same way.
Tom responded calmly to their protests. His eyes cold as ice as he looked back and forth between Richard and Amy, questioning them.
Normally, the husband is the first to know. Something's not right here.
I was just giving her advice. That's all.
Richard stood up and desperately tried to explain.
She told me she might be pregnant. So I rushed over here. When she showed me the positive test, I immediately took her to the obstetrician and gynecologist. What's wrong with that?
My baby's due date is in January. If you can get some time off, Tom, you could be there for the birth. Wouldn't that be great, Tom?
Amy tried to link arms with him, but Tom coldly brushed her off. They didn't seem to realize they were digging themselves deeper and deeper into a hole. Richard, you've been communicating with Amy directly? I don't remember giving you her contact information. Richard froze.
Well, it was in the letter, right?
The only thing in the letter was the address. You heard it directly from Amy, didn't you?
Richard didn't reply. He must have realized that saying anything more would only make things worse. Tom glanced sideways at Amy, giving her a sharp look.
I'm not saying you can't talk to other men, but secretly discussing a pregnancy with someone other than your husband, especially your best friend's spouse, is completely inappropriate, don't you think?
I told you, it was supposed to be a surprise.
Amy snapped, her voice filled with irritation.
Can't you trust me at all? You should have more faith in your wife.
Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. It's sad that you're doubting us just because we talked about a pregnancy.
It was clear that Richard and Amy were desperate to deny their relationship. Sighing, I pulled out the photos and the video I'd taken on my phone and thrust them at the two of them. I saw you two together 2 weeks ago. Maybe Richard was just accompanying Amy because she's in the early stages of pregnancy, but the fact remains that you two spent the night at a hotel together, doesn't it? They clearly hadn't expected me to have seen them. Richard and Amy froze in shock. As they stood there in stunned silence, I continued. I hired a private investigator, and in just 2 weeks, I gathered a mountain of evidence. It's quite something to see two people in their 40s openly hugging and kissing like teenagers, isn't it? Tom was speechless as he looked at the photos of the two of them together. After a long silence, he managed to speak, his voice trembling.
Ever since we got married, Amy started spending more nights away from home, saying she was meeting friends, shopping with her mom, or staying at her parents' house. I was getting suspicious.
Beside the bewildered Tom, Amy wore a sulky expression.
But I always let her go without complaint. I thought she was just lonely because I had to work late and travel for business so often.
I see.
I knew Amy married me for my title, but I never said a word when she decided to be a stay-at-home wife.
I nodded at Tom's words. Richard also used his busy work schedule as an excuse. He'd come home late every night and often be out on weekends. I never imagined he was cheating on me with Amy. I glared at Richard, anger seething within me, but he looked away, avoiding my gaze. So, what kind of excuse do you have now? Are you still going to deny everything? At that moment, Amy finally spoke, her tone brazen.
What can I say? I just prefer Richard over Tom.
Amy curled her lips into a smirk and shamelessly said,
The truth is, I've always had my eye on Richard. But when I missed the reunion, you ended up with him instead. It made me so mad.
She glared back at me.
So, after you two got back from your honeymoon, I made a move on Richard when the three of us went out for drinks. He was quick to take the bait, and I was thrilled.
I widened my eyes in shock. Tom also stared at Amy, disbelief on his face. What? You were cheating right after we got married?
You married me while you were already having an affair with Richard?
Yep, that's right.
Amy admitted it without hesitation.
Sure, Tom, you make good money working for a multinational company. But Richard is better looking and has a better physique, right? And honestly, you're boring.
She laughed as she belittled Tom.
Oh well, too bad. If I had raised the baby as yours, we would have had plenty of money. I was hoping to get the baby into an elite kindergarten and then try for a good private elementary school. But let me tell you, this baby isn't yours. It's Richard's, timing-wise.
She said it brazenly, then turned her gaze back to me.
And you know what, Sarah? It's your fault.
What?
If you had kept a tighter hold on Richard, he wouldn't have cheated on you. He turned to me because you weren't attractive enough for him.
She pointed her finger at me and began spewing this unbelievable logic.
Instead of bad-mouthing Richard and your mother-in-law, you should have worked harder to be more lovable.
Yeah, it's your fault for getting cheated on. We didn't do anything wrong.
Richard and Amy were now completely defiant, and Tom and I could only stare at them in disbelief. To think that the ones who cheated would have the audacity to scold us. I was so stunned that I actually started laughing. As I laughed, Richard, Amy, and Tom looked at me suspiciously. When I finally stopped, I wiped the tears from my eyes. I see. I understand exactly how you two think now. I pulled out another set of photos from my bag and laid them on the table. So, according to you, this wasn't Amy's fault either, just Richard's. Richard glanced at the photos and was left speechless. And no wonder. They were selfies of a naked Amy clinging to another man in bed. Amy's face went pale and she started trembling.
How did you? Where did you get these?
You see, I was in charge of organizing our high school reunion. Thanks to that, a lot of our old classmates attended our wedding. You remember that, don't you, Richard?
Yeah,
Richard answered, his face twisting in discomfort. When I was sending out the wedding photos to our classmates, a few of them mentioned something interesting. They said Amy came onto them, even though they were married. I remembered that recently, so I asked around, and it turns out all of them had been cheating with Amy.
what? All of them. That's more than 5 guys.
Richard's mouth hung open in disbelief. When I told them they might have to pay damages, they all started saying things like, "She told me she was single, and I was tricked." Then they gave me the photos they took with Amy and asked me to give them to you in exchange for forgiveness. I handed Tom a piece of paper with all their phone numbers, just in case. Tom took it, looking a bit bewildered. So, what about it? Did you really pretend to be single? Amy simply nodded without hesitation.
Yes, those guys are so uptight. They wouldn't have fooled around with me unless I said I was single. I took the photos as a collection.
I glanced at Richard, whose expression was growing more intense by the second. But Amy, showing no fear, continued to speak.
You know, Sarah, we went to a prestigious school, and most of our classmates went on to top universities and now work for major companies, especially the guys.
That's true. Amy gave a sly smile.
Our class was pretty elite. Richard was one of the guys I had my eye on. He should be grateful.
I could feel a headache coming on. Sure, Amy was beautiful, and I remembered she used to change boyfriends frequently in school. But I had no idea she thought like this. It was no surprise that Richard wasn't going to accept this. His face was twisted with rage.
Are you out of your mind?
Of course not.
Amy laughed as she replied, and Richard asked her another question.
Is the baby really mine?
Probably. But it doesn't really matter who the father is. They're all good looking, in great shape, and smart. The baby will definitely turn out well.
That's not the point.
Richard shouted. And back to the original topic. Richard, it's your fault that you got cheated on, right? I smiled at him, and Richard fell silent, his face contorted in frustration. The atmosphere at the table was now thick with tension, the untouched feast in front of us forgotten.
I'm sorry, Sarah. This was supposed to be a celebration, but it turned into something like this.
Tom apologized, bowing his head, and I forced a smile. It's okay. After I saw the two of them go into the hotel the other day, I was prepared for today to turn into a showdown. Then, I apologized to Tom. I'm sorry too. This must have been a real shock for you, hearing all of this out of nowhere.
Oh, it's okay.
Tom trailed off, his face hardening as he looked sternly at Amy.
There's no point in continuing this conversation. It's clear I'm not going to hear any words of regret from you. I've lost my appetite, and I don't want to breathe the same air any longer. I'm leaving.
Whatever.
Amy responded indifferently, as if it didn't concern her.
I'll fill out the divorce papers and send them by mail. You can file them yourself. We'll handle alimony and the division of assets through my lawyer.
Divorce? Fine by me. I was planning to marry Richard eventually anyway.
Richard, who had been scowling, suddenly looked shocked.
What?
Of course, those other guys were just for fun.
Amy batted her eyes at Richard and leaned into him.
I've cut ties with all of them, so it's fine, right? Now it's just you, Richard. I'm sorry for cheating, so let's get married.
Her voice was sweet as honey, and Richard, flattered, scratched his head with a sheepish grin.
Well, I guess there's no helping it. You really love me that much?
You're the only one I'm serious about, Richard. That's why I made a move on you, even though you were married to Sarah.
As the two started flirting right in front of Tom and me, I felt like throwing my hands up in surrender. Tom, with a sour expression, pulled out a suitcase and started packing his clothes. Fine by me. You can have him. I stood up, grabbing my bag, and spoke cheerfully to Richard and Amy.
Pretty harsh words for a husband of 3 years. Poor Richard.
See? Sarah is cold-hearted like that.
They clung to each other, shaking their heads in mock sorrow, and I continued. More than Richard, I'm relieved to be free of that troublesome Emily. Amy's face tightened for a moment, but she quickly responded with confidence.
Dealing with a mother-in-law is just part of being married. Complaining about it is just Sarah being selfish.
Richard nodded enthusiastically at her words.
Exactly. You're spot on, Amy. Well said.
Have you fallen for me all over again?
Amy beamed, and Richard smiled back happily.
Yeah. Sarah used to complain just because I gave part of my salary to my mom every month. It's important to have an understanding wife.
Amy's eyes widened in shock as she stared at Richard.
Wait a minute. You're giving money to your mom?
Yeah, that's right.
Richard responded nonchalantly.
It's a child's duty to repay the debt of being raised.
Well, yeah. On bonus months or something?
I give her $3,000 on bonus months and half my salary on the other months.
Amy jumped out of her chair, almost screaming.
Half your monthly salary. How have you even been managing to live?
We've been living off Sarah's salary. I let her work, so it's only fair, right?
Richard explained casually.
Mom spent all of Dad's inheritance on international trips, but she always wants to look her best. So I give her money to buy clothes and bags.
Richard said this with an innocent smile, but Amy turned pale.
So your mom has no savings, and that means there's no money for her to go into a facility or for her funeral.
Richard frowned in annoyance.
I'll cover the funeral expenses. I'm planning to get the best package. And as for putting my dear mom in a facility, no way. It's the wife's job to take care of her until the end.
Amy held her head in her hands, then turned to me, snapping.
Sarah, you didn't tell me any of this.
Well, it's about money, so it was hard to bring up.
That, and the fact that Richard is a total mama's boy.
Amy shrieked, her eyes wild. I calmly replied, "Oh, I didn't mention that. I guess there were just too many complaints to go through them all." It was true, but Amy seemed to think I deliberately kept it from her.
So you never really trusted me, huh? Fine, Richard, let's break up.
Yeah. Wait, what?
Richard looked confused.
You're a department manager at a big company, but if you're giving your salary to your mom, there's nothing left for me. I'm not sticking around to be poor.
Then why don't you just work to make up the difference, Amy? So that's it. You are only with me for the money?
Richard's temple throbbed with anger.
You lying woman. None of you ever planned to take care of my mom.
I've done more than enough for you and Emily, I said coldly to the fuming Richard. If your mom is that important to you, then take care of her yourself.
Caregiving is the wife's job. That's what marriage is for.
Richard's anger was obvious, and I felt a deep sense of disappointment. Even if he hadn't cheated, we never would have understood each other. At that moment, as Tom was packing his things, he suddenly remembered something and said to Amy,
Oh, and when we get divorced, you'll be paying back the loan in addition to the alimony.
Amy looked puzzled.
Loan? What loan?
Did you forget? You used my card without permission, $200,000.
Amy thought for a moment, then gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. She really had forgotten.
But we're going to split the marital assets, right? If I get this apartment, or if Tom gives me an equivalent amount of money, we can call it even.
What are you talking about? I bought this place before we got married, so it's not yours.
Tom's words made Amy's face go pale. Her previous confidence seemed to stem from the assumption that she would get a share of the assets.
And just so you know, the 2 luxury cars are mine too. The only thing you'll have left is the compact car.
Amy's eyes widened and she began to tremble.
No, that's not fair. I'm a housewife. How am I supposed to pay alimony to Sarah too?
Why don't you go cry to your parents? It'll be tough with the baby on the way, but that's not my problem.
Tom shifted his gaze from the collapsed Amy to Richard and added a final warning.
I'll be coming after you for alimony as well, Richard.
Yeah, I get it.
Tom left the room ahead of us. He said he would be staying at a hotel until the divorce was finalized. I also packed my things and left the apartment with Richard. When we reached the parking lot, we got into our separate cars and drove home. I signed the divorce papers, left them on the dining table, packed my clothes and other belongings into a suitcase, and left the houses. Until Richard and I decided who would keep the house, I planned to stay in a weekly rental apartment I had already arranged. Luckily, Richard agreed to the divorce without much resistance. He even paid the $20,000 alimony in a lump sum using borrowed money, so we were able to part ways cleanly. After the divorce, Richard continued to work as if nothing had happened, but his luck ran out when he ran into an old high school friend at work. After he drunkenly admitted that his affair with Amy was the cause of the divorce, the story quickly spread throughout his company. Richard, who was leading a major project that had been in the works for years, couldn't just quit his job. Now, he has to endure the cold stares of his boss and colleagues every day. When he confessed the reason for the divorce to his mom, Emily, their relationship soured. Emily, always concerned with appearances, felt ashamed of her son for having an affair with his wife's best friend. I heard that Richard told a mutual friend of ours that he felt lonely and rejected when his parents turned him away coldly whenever he tried to visit. But Amy was an even bigger problem than Richard. She kept coming up with excuses to delay paying the $20,000 in alimony. It was only after I threatened to sue that she finally responded.
We're best friends, right? Can't you lower the amount? I'm about to have a baby.
I was beyond exasperated, but I persisted and convinced her through my lawyer. 6 months later, she finally paid the full amount in one lump sum to my bank account. After being kicked out of the high-rise apartment by Tom, Amy went crying to her wealthy parents, who ended up paying the alimony to me and the debt to Tom. Amy's parents even called me personally to apologize. A DNA test confirmed that the baby wasn't Richard's. It was likely one of her classmates, but there were too many candidates to pinpoint the father, making it difficult to pursue child support. Amy's parents were so fed up with her that they considered cutting ties with her, but they couldn't bring themselves to do it because of their unborn grandchild. Instead, they decided to put her to work in the family business they ran. After graduating from college, Amy enjoyed living on her own, supported by an allowance from her parents, while working part-time jobs. After marrying Tom, who worked for a large company, she lived the high life as a housewife while indulging in affairs. But now, her life has completely changed. She's under her mother's strict supervision, working from morning until night. When she gets home, she has to care for her child, leaving no time to rest. Her salary goes toward her child's needs and repaying her parents, with nothing left for herself.
Sarah, I was wrong. I'm sorry. So could you please talk to my mom and ask her to give me some free time and pocket money? She nags me every day, and I feel suffocated.
Fed up with her constant pleading, I blocked Amy's contact. Serves her right. After divorcing Richard, I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. Now, I can enjoy my eggs however I want, whether runny or firm, without anyone complaining. It's unfortunate that I lost both my husband and my best friend, but I consider it a valuable life lesson. Thankfully, I have good relationships with my colleagues at work, so I didn't feel too much of a sense of loss. From now on, I plan to focus on both my work and personal life and enjoy the rest of my life to the fullest.